And welcome to this month's meeting of the Language and Brain Interest Group. I'm Matt, I'm on the organizing committee, and the purpose of this forum is to facilitate interdisciplinary scientific discussions among UF researchers, clinicians, and students about the complex relationships between language, brain, and behavior. And today we have the great pleasure of hearing from Dr. Patricia K. Kuhl, who will be speaking to us about early language learning and brain development. Dr. Kuhl is a professor of speech and hearing sciences at the University of Washington, where she serves as the Bezos Family Foundation Endowed Chair and the co-director of the Institute for Learning and Brain Sciences, which for those of you who don't know, it's an important and highly productive research group in Seattle with many top-notch scientists, including Drs. Andrew Meltzoff, Adrian Lee, and Saumu Taulu. Dr. Kuhl also serves as the director of the NSF Science of Learning Center, LIFE, which stands for Learning in Informal and Formal Environments. She's known internationally for her distinguished and continuing achievements in pioneering research on speech and language processing. Throughout her career, she's made numerous major contributions to the field, some of which I'll briefly highlight here. At the start of her career in the 70s, when the motor theory of speech perception was the dominant model in the field, she demonstrated that other animals with auditory systems similar to that of humans, but which do not have the biological capacity to produce speech, nevertheless show evidence of categorical-like perception of speech. And she showed this first with chinchillas and then with rhesus macaques. In the 80s, she and Andrew Meltzoff reported the first experimental evidence that young infants can recognize the cross-modal correspondences between the acoustic and optical structures of speech, and that young babies are capable of imitating prosodic and segmental aspects of speech. Then in the 90s, she showed that in the first months of life, infants learn to organize speech sounds into phonetic categories with a graded internal structure, and that the acoustic signature of infant-directed speech and the social context in which it's embedded play an important role in that learning. Most recently, she's demonstrated through the pioneering use of magnetoencephalography with infants that passive listening to speech activates speech motor as well as auditory processing areas, which has important implications for our scientific understanding of sensory motor integration for speech. And so you might say that about every decade or so, Kuhl has shaken up how we think about the nature and development of phonetic aspects of linguistic communication. And finally, I'd just like to note that in addition to conducting groundbreaking research, she and her colleagues in Seattle are highly committed to bridging their scientific discoveries made in the lab with real-world applications designed to maximize learning in infants and young children. Under her leadership at iLabs, they have worked collaboratively with educators and policymakers, including at the White House, to help advocate for evidence-based changes that will help to improve the cognitive, linguistic, and social development of children worldwide. And so it's really an honor to have Dr. Kuhl here with us. So please give her a very warm welcome.
Matt, that was incredible. Thank you so much. It's lovely to sort of think about the early work that you did and how it changes over time. And one of the things that you always remind yourself is how long it takes to make a new discovery. It does feel like you should remind students that it takes 5 years to do anything, to do something that's going to change anyone's mind, and actually 10 years to make a real difference. So thank you so much, Matt. And thanks for the invitation. It's lovely to speak to this group in Florida. I know you're extremely active and you're out there influencing the world, which is exactly what we all need to try to do. So today I want to sort of carry through with the story, focusing on social interaction, sensory motor learning, and their contribution to the child's developing mind. We all know that babies are fascinating, and when you are a behavioral scientist, the things that you can observe babies doing and the sophistication of measurement techniques over the years has been incredible. But these behavioral assays now are being informed in an entirely new way by the tools of modern neuroscience. And so you see here a little one, and I'll show you a bigger picture later, a little one in an MEG machine, magnetoencephalography, MEG for short. This machine is on, it's silent, non-invasive. It's like a stethoscope for the brain. There are 306 squid devices in that plastic dewar, and they're picking up magnetic fields that are directly related to the neural firing in the brain. So what we can learn is amazing, and I'll show you some of the data today. But we're combining that functional neural imaging with MEG with many tools of structural brain imaging now. The change of the last 5 years in structural brain imaging has been absolutely shocking. The measures of myelin, the measures, the diffusion tensor imaging, the degree to which you can look at kind of neural crowding in the brain has just produced an amazing set of techniques that are now being applied to babies with great difficulty. But so this multimodal imaging is an approach that we're taking at iLabs. And the purpose of this work is to really understand what all of us see every day, which is that social interaction and language blooming between parents and children that seems to be the sort of catalyst for lifelong communication skills that we all enjoy and need. What would we do without them? And so let's start from something we all understand. You practically don't need to show this, but it's also always good to remind people that there is a sensitive or critical period for the learning of a second language. And biologists are extremely impressed with this phenomenon and mention it very frequently, that in the field of human development, there is this phenomenon of a critical period where the acquisition of a second language is constrained by age. And this is a cartoonish summary that was first published by Johnson and Newport back in 1989. But nobody, I don't think, really disagrees with this representation. There is a loss of the ability not to learn, like you can learn a language beyond the infancy. You can learn a second language, but you won't do it with the same, if you go after adolescence, you won't do it with the same mental machinery. You won't learn it with the same facility. At least that appears to be an adequate summary of the data thus far. Now, of course, I always hope that by studying the initial phases of learning, to really let the babies tell us how it's done, what are the features of learning that they possess that we don't possess, or at least we'd have to work harder to possess, that could change the way adults try to learn second languages. So the purpose of the work in my lab has been to take this, one of the initial periods of learning. There's a period for phonetic learning, there's a lexical learning and syntactic learning, and it's this early phonetic learning that happens in the first year of life that's been the behavioral assay for me, and to try to understand what is going on during that phenomenal period of learning in the first year. So we developed here in Seattle in the 1970s. There was a test when I came to work at the University of Washington in 1976, there was a test being used in the auditory laboratories where babies would be conditioned to turn their head at the presentation of a sound. And it was looking at that and watching, Rebecca Eilers was here at the time, and she had done the first tests of taking a background sound, a syllable, and changing it to another syllable, and using this head turn as a measurement of learning. And so I adopted that technique, refined it, and used it in many studies. And I'll show you what it looks like in the next slide. There's a short movie. You'll see a baby sitting on a mother's lap. There's a distracting assistant over to the baby's right, and the assistant is playing with toys and keeping the baby's attention. There's a sound coming out of a loudspeaker on the left. The baby's job is to listen for a sound change, because they are trained that when the sound changes, there's a reinforcement that will be provided if the turn is made within about 3 seconds. So here's a short movie showing that.
Can a baby as young as 6 months old hear the difference between two vowels? This baby is trained to look for the toy when the sound changes. She's being distracted, so she'll turn only when she hears the difference in sounds. The key question, will she turn before the toy lights up?
E, E.
So you see, she's really good at this. And babies around the world at that time in the 70s and 80s, I had laboratories there was a time when I had 8 countries covered with this apparatus or brain imaging with ERPs to look at babies' ability to hear differences from all the languages of the world. And the summary statement is that all babies everywhere can discriminate virtually every one of the contrasts that we gave them, regardless of the language that they're listening to. Meaning we called them citizens of the world. They were just capable at that early period of distinguishing all of the sound contrasts. And so, the parents sitting behind them obviously couldn't. While the babies were citizens of the world, the parents sitting behind them were culture-bound listeners. They had already been exposed to language or languages, and their keen observation was of the sounds that they'd been exposed to in those languages and not those of foreign languages. So the next question was, when do they become like us? When does that citizen of the world turn into a culture-bound listener? And here's one of the results that tells the story. Janet Worker had demonstrated that children between 6 and 12 months will decline in their perception of foreign language contrasts. But until we went to Japan, this was published in 2006, we went to Tokyo with our team and did head turn with the Japanese babies and did in Seattle the same tests using raw and law and switched whether the background was raw or law, regardless of that background condition and what was foregrounded. Babies in Tokyo and in Seattle were perfectly good at discriminating the contrast to about 65% at that 6 to 8 month period. But 2 months later, something really important happened. Not only was there a decline in non-native languages, there was a huge and significant increase in native language perception. This ruled out all kinds of theoretical accounts that there are innate feature detectors that are just waiting for input, and they will either maintain or atrophy. It says there's an active learning process going on. And the active learning process is kind of waiting for language experience, as one would think during a sensitive period, expecting and dependent on language experience to show that increase. So I felt that this was a theoretical turning point. There was something very important going on in this period between about 8 and 10 months, and that the job was to figure out what it was. And we had by that time also verified that you could get a brain measure to show the same thing. So using event-related potentials, baby here is wearing a cap with the electrodes in it. And you see on the right, something akin to a head turn, but doesn't require any behavior. When a sound is repeated, like the rah, 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 and then the deviant sound presented only on 15% of the trials is a novel one like la, that deviant sound produces this negativity that you see there in the waveform. And this was named the mismatch negativity by those who discovered it in Finland. And we did these kinds of experiments with, again, a whole raft of speech sounds to show that yes, at 6 months, you can see that all babies are treating native and non-native sounds as discriminable and showing that very prominent deviant negativity. And then as you move towards 11 months, they begin to show that deviant response only for native language sounds. And what was incredible was that we could show using these measures how important that early discrimination is. So what we show here in panel A is the baby wearing the cap. In panel B, we've got that individual baby's sounds. Now this is at 7.5 months. I decided to test at 7.5 months because I wanted to get kids on the cusp. I wanted to see a big variation in ability to do this. So some kids at 7.5 months will still be discriminating everything. And other kids, like this child, is already showing a prominent negativity to the native sound, but hardly any negativity to the non-native sound. So when you look at kids as a group, which we see in panel C, and you do a median split, and you look at the native predictor on the left, you take the half of the kids that are better at the native, the best half of the distribution, top half of the distribution, plot their acquisition of words produced between 14 and 30 months. You see how good they are, how fast they are propelled towards a good vocabulary. The lower half of the distribution is significantly poorer. And so kids who are good at native language discrimination at this child at 7.5 months is zooming forward in language. Do the same thing on the right to the non-native predictor. Do a median split, take the kids who are best at it and worst at it. The kids who are better at non-native production are growing language more slowly. And that fit the theory that we were developing, that kids are actually having to commit neurally. They're developing machinery and architecture to detect the features of native language sounds. And the more they stay in phase one, where they treat native and non-native equivalently, the slower their language is going to develop. It takes attentional mechanisms. It takes a focus on the baby's part on what's happening in the environment, what parents are producing, the native language or languages. The theory held for both monolingual and bilingual kids. It's a matter of attention. And so it turns out that this early discrimination is quite a robust predictor. Christina Zhao has just published a paper that shows that non-native discrimination at 11 months of age, exactly what we had shown in earlier studies, is a negative predictor for the speed of language growth out to the age of 6 years, when kids are 6 years of age. And that non-native perception, if it's really, really good, can indicate kids who are at risk for speech and language disorders. So there is a phenomenon about this process of learning. And these data ruled out that it was auditory acuity. Obviously, if auditory acuity explained what was going on, native and non-native would be equal, because we're talking about form and transitions and auditory cues. And also using a brain measure rather than a behavior measure took it out of the realm of cognition. We had taken cognition away. Some kids find the head turn a little confusing. But when you're doing ERPs, they do nothing. They're just sitting there being entertained. And so we ruled out in our early prediction papers, speech predicts language. We had these really hard reviewers who said it must be something else. Speech isn't connected to language. It really is discontinuous. And I said, no, it is a continuous process, and we'll prove it. And this was the study that actually proved that it was a real connection between speech perception and later language. So then we had a new set of questions. So there's something magical happening during that early period. What is it? So we decided to expose infants to a new natural language during that sensitive period. And we did that because the question about why is the sensitive period waiting so long? Kids are listening to a lot of speech in the first 6 months of life. Why does it take until 8 months for them to make this change between native and non-native sounds? And one argument was they're building up a statistical distribution of the sounds. At that time, I was arguing that the critical period could be based on mathematics, that you would start to reject non-native sounds and pay attention only to native when your statistical distribution included all the variants you encountered. You know, the next ah you heard fit right into the distribution of ahs that you heard. And so you needed all that time to build up the statistical representation. But testing at exposing for the first time at 9 months would say if they can learn newly from language at 9 months, then that's not the explanation. So that was the experiment we designed. And we had asked at the time, if we change perception by exposure to a new language, do we do anything to speech production? And this question got at the kind of sensory motor nature of language, because Andy Meltzoff and I had shown quite early, 1996, that in the laboratory, when exposed to an auditory visual version of a vowel, if you bring babies in at 12 weeks, I mean, really the earliest phases in which they can produce speech-like sounds, 12, 16, and 20 weeks, we watched the development of the ability to imitate a vowel they heard. We did not see it at 12 weeks. 16 weeks, there were hints, but it was not significant. By 20 weeks, we could see that babies exposed to ah will produce more ah-like vowels than e or oo-like vowels. And those exposed to e and oo would do that similarly for those vowels. So they've got the machinery, they've got sensory motor machinery. So when we're exposing babies and change perception, what have we done to speech production? So here's the background for that exposure experiment. We decided to use Mandarin Chinese because there's a Chi-Chi contrast that I can't discriminate in natural speech, but of course, all the native speakers of Mandarin in my lab can. And we had tested in Taipei and Seattle to see how this Mandarin Chinese contrast was, this fricative contrast was handled by the babies. And we saw this traditional outcome where the babies in Taipei who had been exposed to Mandarin are zooming forward between 8 and 12 months, whereas the American infants not exposed are declining exactly as you'd expect. And everybody in all of these studies they're doing exactly what they need to do to acquire words. This is a good thing that they are declining in non-native discrimination. So what we did was expose the American kids to an intervention, give them 12 sessions, 25 minutes each of natural reading and playing, 4 different talkers. So we got talker variation. And it turns out that on average, over those 12 sessions between 9 and 10 and a half months, they heard about 33,000 syllables. So it's quite a pretty good dosage of exposure to Mandarin. So here's a version of one of those sessions.
Jasper， 早安 Finn。嗨，我们要来讲一个故事哦。今天要讲的故事是《小熊七七探险记》。来看看发生了什么事情哦。小熊七七在这里，一个绿色的圈圈，绿色的圈圈，绿色的圈圈，再转一下，转一圈，嘿，一圈，再一次哦，转一二三。
Okay, so what we noticed was how rapt the babies were during these sessions. It looked like they were really learning. And so the question was, did they learn? And of course, we had to run a control condition where the babies came into the lab and had all of that excitement of being read and played to in a language, but the control group heard only English, whereas those exposed to Mandarin were hearing a brand new language. And look at the outcome. The kids exposed to English, our control group did not improve on Mandarin, thank goodness. So we had a real experiment going. And those exposed to Mandarin did a phenomenal job of learning during those 12 sessions. They're statistically equivalent to the babies who, growing up in Taipei, who had been listening to this for 10 and a half months. So our next question was, what role is the human being playing? So we ran another group of babies in which we had recorded beautiful DVDs of the presentations made in the live sessions and presented these, videoed sessions in the same room with the same dosage, 12 sessions, parents sitting behind them exactly as we had before to see whether or not babies could learn from a machine. And you're seeing the AV condition here. We also ran an audio only condition because all of us, grad students included, were kind of predicting that this AV condition might work. Babies looked very attentive during it. They crawled up to it, they touched the screen. And we contrasted it with an audio only where they heard the soundtrack, identical soundtrack, but they looked at a teddy bear on the screen. And the projection was that they might learn under the TV condition and not the audio only. But here's our graph again, and here's audio only, absolutely no learning whatsoever, and the TV condition, again, no learning whatsoever. So this was amazing and surprising, and led us to start arguing that the social condition, the context, that social interaction that takes place live, as messy as it is, as opposed to what's happening when you just see a flat screen TV and you get the same material. I think statistical learning theorists would have had to claim that the audio only would have been sufficient, but this suggested that there's a huge difference between merely hearing the audio track and looking at the person as opposed to experiencing the live situation. So there was something special about social, and I started to argue that the social brain gates learning in a way that we have now begun to uncover. What does it mean to say that social context provides something more that gates the potential for infants to learn? What would that mean in evolution? That the mechanisms of social processing and the mechanisms of language learning were that wedded. And so we designed additional experiments where we wanted to know how generalizable this phenomenon was. So we began to test in Spanish. In Spanish, we had 4 cameras. We were getting fancy about tracking babies' eye movements during the sessions. And we had other plans in ways that we could understand what was happening as kids were learning. So here's a little snippet of this one with the 4 cameras showing you what's going on.
Te da un besito. Besito. Porque te quiere, ¿no? Con la boca te da un besito. Qué rico es el pan. Muchas gracias, Lucas. Mía. 2, 3. Hola, ¿cómo estás? ¿Estás bien, Spencer? ¿Te gusta el pan? ¡Qué rico!
Okay, so pay attention to how much those kids are vocalizing. Turns out they vocalize quite a bit in these social settings. And I'll show you the graphic later, but the most amazing study that we have just published in 2020, but data were taken right after this experiment was done with Diego and other Spanish native speakers exposing babies to the language, is this one. This one published by Megha Sundara, who is a postdoc in the lab. We just published this past year. Again, it was an arduous process getting it through reviewers because it was hard to believe that when you bring the babies who had been exposed to Spanish back to the lab 30 days later, after parents were told, do not expose your infants any further to Spanish, we had shown, just back up a minute, we had shown that babies not only learned phonetically during those sessions. So this was a pre-post design that we ran with Barbara Conboy as the lead investigator, who was a postdoc at the time. We tested both Spanish and English perception with ERPs ahead of time and then after the 12 sessions. And as you'd expect, English was discriminated at both times. Spanish was not discriminated before the exposure, but was discriminated afterwards. And in addition, Barbara Conboy tested 10 words that in the Spanish exposure the babies were exposed to, and 10 control words. She showed, but she's been extremely busy and she hasn't published yet, that babies are picking up signatures of the words, and they will neurally show that those 10 words that they were exposed to are neurally recognized in the brain when tested after the session. So the learning that's going on is substantial, it's robust, and it goes beyond phonetic learning. But back to this one, what Megha did, Sundara, was bring these same kids back 30 days later. And she had an interlocutor who played with the babies on the floor in a very natural setting, either speaking English or Spanish, while recording the babies with Lena. And her hypothesis was that you've not only changed perception, but you've changed production. And you've not changed production just wholly. Kids are not babbling in Spanish as they crawl around at home, but it's evoked especially by the Spanish speaker who's talking to them. And her evidence, published in 2020, you can go look at it, provides very strong evidence that that is what's happening in these babies exposed to Spanish. She brought in another group of infants who had not been exposed to Spanish at all and just tested to make sure that they're not just good imitators at this age. And she showed that being in front of a Spanish speaker and playing with a Spanish talking speaker did not evoke Spanish-like utterances from the babies. Only the kids in the exposed group. She brought in bilingual babies who had from birth been exposed to both Spanish and English, and they show the same effect. So either being raised as a bilingual or being in our exposure experiments brought this about. So it certainly suggests that this sensory motor ability that kids have, that as experience rolls into the perceptual system, it's also doing something to the production repertoire. It's doing something to the representations that are formed that allow the baby to flexibly recall them when they come back 30 days later and are placed in front of a Spanish speaker, which I think is stunning, a stunning finding. And it makes me think back to the work that I did with Alison Dope a long time ago. This is a drawing that we've reproduced many times. Alison Dope is no longer with us. She was a phenomenal neuroscientist who was studying songbird learning of their species-specific songs. And we showed that both in songbirds and in human babies, there's a period of time in which there's a listening going on, a sensory learning period, and you commit sensory information to memory. And then later in development for humans, that's at about 10 months, maybe beginning as early as 6 months, there's a kind of sensory motor period where the motor system gets involved. And she had observed that in young songbirds as well. And so we argued that there's a kind of two-stage process, sensory first, and then sensory motor. And we're going to come back to this at the end of the talk, because I think as we adjust our theories, I think probably we are heading towards one in which I will take our native language magnet expanded theory and adjust that to say sensory and motor information is going back and forth at a much earlier time. Something is allowing a two-way communication quite early. So we're going to return to this point. Okay, so let's stand a little while on this point about why don't infants learn from a machine? I mean, really, why don't they? We saw no evidence of learning in that group that had been exposed to the television set. They were as flat as the control group, really not one iota of evidence that kids were learning from the television set. And so we had wanted to do a series of experiments to try to understand why. And in 2015, again, this is Barbara Conboy taking the lead. She had in her Spanish experiments analyzed the gaze shifts when the tutors like Diego would hold up a new toy and name it in Spanish. What she did was for the 30 seconds that followed, she tracked eye movements and gaze shifts that the babies made. Who did they look at? Where did they look? And it turns out that the babies who shifted their gaze between the tutor and the toy, so they're looking at where the tutor's looking and looking at the toy. The kids who did a high proportion of these gaze shifts following the introduction of a new toy are the kids whose ERP scores of learning Spanish are higher. So this tight coupling between gaze shifts and learning of Spanish, I think, is again an indicator of why social is so much better than a television set. You can't really in 2D track those eye movements very well. And it's possible that kids aren't motivated to track the eye movements. And so you just don't get it. So this is an information component. Social provides information hotspots. The babies and we look where others look. We do that all our lives. If someone looks up or down or to the side, you tend to follow their gaze. Babies are doing it at 9 months. And the more they do it, the more they learn in our natural language exposure experiments. But then we decided that we wanted to test another hypothesis. We had noted in our original experiments that the degree to which babies were learning with others seemed to be correlated with the amount that they learned. And this was true in the original head turn. This was true in the Spanish ERP data, that learning together seemed to be better than learning alone. But we had never designed an experiment to get at it, so maybe it was just a spurious outcome. So we designed a new experiment where kids were randomly assigned to learn solo or learn in pairs. So the technique took the hardest condition, the video condition, but gave kids an incentive potentially, and maybe an aid to learning, which was to bring their attention to it by letting them slap the screen, touch the screen in any way, which would present 20 seconds of the original videotapes. And then it would go to checkerboard and they'd have to do it again. But the experimental condition was this: what happens when it's one baby learning alone versus two babies learning together? And we designed the experiment to target one of the babies in a pair. So let's say that the little boy with the red pants on here, he's our target learner. And we're adjusting how many different learners he is paired with when he learns. Our original hypothesis was the more the baby he learns with stays constant, the more he'll learn. we were thinking babies collaborate, they'll get to know one another, it will be more fun to see that same baby again, maybe they'll teach each other to touch the screen, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what's fun about science is you genuinely can get surprised. And we were shocked to learn that, first of all, the only babies who learn were those in the paired group. So at the top, you may not be an ERP expert, but I'll make it simple. The gray bar is where you should look, because that's the timing for the neural signature of the mismatch negativity. And the mismatch negativity, the MMN, is shown in the blue curve. So in this gray bar right here, you see the blue at FZ and CZ, two electrode locations for paired infants in the paired group. Individual infants just don't show it at all. They show a little positivity, an early positivity that seems to be equated with exposure to something, but not general learning. It's this negativity that's characteristic of the MMN, even in adults. We only see that in the paired infants. So that answers question one. Pairing infants for learning really makes a difference. But look at this one. This is what surprised us. It wasn't that learning with the familiar person helped your learning. It was learning with unique babies. So I'm plotting here the number of unique learning partners and showing the MMN, which the better you are, the more negative it is. So we're expecting to see a negative correlation. And what you see here is that as the number of unique learning partners for that little kid in the red pants went from 3 to 6, I'm using his as an individual example, but this is group data, they show a stronger MMN. So we have a neural signature of learning that's going up with the novelty of your social learning partner. Now, I think this is fascinating, and it links learning to the reward system. It links learning to social novelty, probably means that deep in our evolution, that when a novel person came onto the scene, it heightened your sense of ability to learn or pay attention to them, because it was an opportunity for communication to occur. Now that's a stretch, that's a speculation, but it's a fun way to think about why we see it. And also, as social partners increased, this graph that represents MMN is the same if you look at infants' vocalizations. The more novel the partner, the more they vocalized. So it's like vocalizations are an attempt to communicate. You communicate more when the partner is novel. You're trying to figure out who that is. I think this is such an interesting outcome, not only in a pandemic year when we're all frozen away from one another, but the idea that our systems, especially those we evolved to communicate with, crave social interaction, and it actually has a real purpose, not just to entertain us socially, but it enhances learning. I mean, we're going to continue to track this down, but I found this absolutely fascinating. So this brought us to the brain. So, you know, why do you buy a $2.5 million machine and put little babies in it? Because you're trying to see under the hood. You're trying to understand, well, what's going on that I can't see? I mean, we've got wonderful behavior. I mean, thank goodness we've got these behavioral assays that are so phenomenal, but we still need to see underneath. So here's our MEG machine, non-invasive, completely safe, silent. So it gives you the opportunity to present sounds. And here again is our little 6-monther in the machine. She's listening through so insert earphones so that you were listening to the natural noise of the machine, which is basically nil, while she's listening to sounds and in other experiments, words. And it looks deceptively simple. It's a technical tour de force because the little cap that she's wearing tracks her head. She's not moving her head too much, but there are some kids who move quite a bit, depending on the task. And at all times, you want to know where the structures of the brain are. So it makes a difference that you can actually see. You can track in 3D where that little head is. So that's why we need so many physicists and engineers to work on this task. And here's the kind of data we get. So I'm just showing you one 12-monther, a monolingual, so already committed to English, where you see 150 areas color coded, but we're focusing on auditory and Broca's. Broca's is an interesting sequencer of behavior, social and learning, reading, word production, and the arcuate between them. Now, this is a double oddball where the standard sound, that's the brain activity in auditory and Broca's for the standard sound repeating in the background. Now, on 10% of the trials, you get a new sound that's English, same language as the original one. You can see how auditory areas go up, but you can also see in these that Broca's is active right from the moment the sound comes on. But look what happens when you present the Spanish deviant. Auditory doesn't go up so much, but look what happens to Broca's. Broca's just takes a big jump. So the interesting thing from our standpoint is to look at what happens to Broca's and the auditory area. They're computing different things. Auditory is computing information regarding the auditory signal, and it's going up when the native sound changes. Broca's is engaged at all moments, but it really takes a jump up when a sound is presented that it doesn't know as much about. So I'm interpreting this, that we've got a system in which these two areas, auditory and motor planning areas. So I'm not showing you pre-motor cortex, real motor cortex. I'm showing you motor planning areas. And interestingly, the cerebellum, another motor planning area, also monitored in this experiment, shows exactly the same result as Broca's. I'm arguing that what's going on is all along in learning, there's information exchange between auditory and motor regions and Broca's. And what Broca's is doing is attempting to map what it would take to match the sound. What are the features of that sound? Now, babies at the early ages we tested, 6 months was the earliest age. 6-monthers show the same pattern, not the response to Spanish. They show across the board that Broca's is active and they treat English and Spanish equivalently. But by 6 months, what do kids know about motor? You would say they would not know very much. They're not canonically babbling yet for the most part. They're cooing though. And so this nascent map that's developing between articulation and the auditory results of articulation are telling kids that when they hear a sound, it has properties that they can reproduce because they're learning by playing with their vocal tract, a kind of vocal babbling. They're just playing with their articulators. What happens when you move the tongue front and back and up and down? And it isn't trial and error. They develop a schema, and that schema probably helps unpack speech sounds and is feeding forward information about its reproducibility, such that by 11, 12 months, this Spanish sound that they're listening to for the first time, they don't really have a vocal schema that covers that sound. So anyway, this is what we're kind of thinking about now with regard to what the babies are doing during that time. So it brings you back to the importance of language input. If when we talk to babies, the brain is doing this, what I just showed you, every time you talk to an infant, you're activating the motor regions. And I can just give you a heads up that doctoral student Maggie Clark is now looked at data from 2-monthers, 6-monthers, 7-monthers, 10-monthers, and 12-monthers. During the pandemic, she took all existing studies at iLabs, and her dissertation is to look at what hadn't been looked at, not my study that had looked at that, but all the other studies that had focused on auditory responses. And she looked at motor responses. And it looks as though at 2 months, there's activation for speech, which is amazing to me because it is prior to babbling, it's prior to cooing. They really don't know how this works yet, but her evidence tends to suggest that when they hear speech, a ba, that motor, that Broca's area, that premotor cortex is activated. So stay tuned because I think it's just going to get more and more exciting here. But it does remind you of the importance of language input and this back and forth that is the social dance of language. So, you know, from work that lots of people have done, but we've been interested in it way back when Anne Fernald was in the lab doing her dissertation on the infant's preference when given a choice between infant-directed and adult-directed speech. And for those of you who don't know what this looks like, many of you do, this is the pitch contour for adult-directed at the top, AD, and infant-directed at the bottom. And of course, just looking at it, the eyeball test convinces you they're totally different. The top record sounds like me. It's not boring. I'm making changes in pitch, but I'm not doing what I would do if I had a 2-monther on my lap. You know, this, can you say ah? Say ah. Hey, you say hi, hi. She goes up to 700 hertz. I mean, mothers, fathers, grandparents, older sibs. This is pretty culturally universal. And the question that we began to ask is, how important is it? We demonstrated in a science paper in 1997 that across English, Russian, and Swedish, if you took the centers of the vowels during this AD speech and the ID speech, and you took the point vowels E, A, and U, you saw that what adult speakers do is automatically stretch that vowel triangle. They're giving twice the space between vowels when they're speaking to infants as opposed to adults. They over-articulate and they acoustically exaggerate. So it should be an ideal signal for learning. And in fact, tests in the lab, again, other students, Mei Lu did a study in which she showed that the more mothers expanded their vowel triangles at home, the better babies were at tests of phonetic perception of consonants in the laboratory. So we could at least draw a link, not a causal link, but a link between the use of this parentese, motherese type of speech and speech perception. But it took another team of students. This is Neuron, Ramirez Esparza, and Garcia Sierra, Adrian Garcia Sierra, who are now at the University of Connecticut. She was a social psychologist. Neuron wanted to take these measures into the home. And so for the first time, we recorded babies with Lena at home. And she was interested not only in the sound, but the social context. And she started paying attention to one-on-one interactions. You can tell from Lena whether 2 speakers or 1 speaker are there and talking. And so she took measures not only of the style of speech, whether it's standard or parentese, but whether it was group or one-on-one. And she showed that parentese is strongly associated at 11 months. The prevalence at 11 months is strongly linked to words produced at 24 months. And that's what you see on the left. And parentese one-on-one, parentese alone is good. Parentese one-on-one is fabulous. And it looks as though that from her data that the one-on-one had a special feature. And again, sort of reinforcing the social nature of this parentese effect. Whereas standard speech basically has no effect. It looks like a negative correlation, but it's not significant. So standard speech isn't doing anything. Parentese, you've got the association, again, not causal. But then we wanted to design the causal experiment. So we designed a parent coaching experiment. And this is Naya Ferhan Ramirez's work. She's now assistant professor here in linguistics at UW. She designed a parent coaching experiment, randomly assigned parents to coaching versus non-coaching. And she showed that when you bring parents in at 6, 10, 14, and 18 months, and you share with them, kind of like a Fitbit, you share knowledge gleaned from the Zoom, but not from Zoom, gleaned from the Lena recordings about their prevalence of parentese. You put it on a distribution and you say, in studies we've done, this is the distribution of how much parentese parents use at home. And here's where you are on that distribution. We didn't tell them what to do, but we did tell them, here's where you are. And we did say parentese seems to be associated with better language outcomes. We also explained that brains are growing and that we think these signals that you're presenting to babies are encouraging brain development and language development. So when you do that, and the kids in the control groups were monitored in the exact same way, but the parents were coached. So here you see the graph looking at what coaching did to modulate parentees. And they were not significantly different at 6 months, but as you see, at 10 months, they're stretching apart. By 14 months, they're significantly different. By 18 months, they remain significantly different. So our coaching increased parentees. What else did it do? Parentees, this coaching about parentees was linked to increases in babbling and conversational turns. So conversational turns are defined by, within 5 seconds of a parent saying something, the infant is making a vocalization that is speech-like. So in the early phases at 10 months, this is babbled utterances, not burping or anything that's vegetative, but language related. And you can see that the kids who are being raised by parents who are coached are really tremendously increasing their conversational turns. And so you see a big effect on the conversational turns, which we are now turning to as more and more important with regard to brain data. And here is the final graph on the parent coaching study. You can see that by 18 months, 14 months as well, the outcomes measured with all the traditional outcome measures show greatly advanced language development in the 18-monthers whose parents had been coached. So we think these data are quite stunning from a couple of perspectives. One, it shows you that you can actually change parent behavior. And we didn't know that. I mean, while parents the world over pretty naturally produce parentees, it doesn't say that you can modulate it. And this proved that you could modulate parents' use of parentees. And then secondly, when they do that, you can see that you've altered both conversational turns and child language outcomes. Now we are now working on the data from the 18-month period out to 30 months. And we've got, it is amazing to see how that difference between the two groups continues way out to 30 months. It's as though we've put them on a different trajectory with the parent coaching. And then here's some of the newest data coming out of the MRI lab. This is Libby Huber's work, and it's in prep for publication. What she's doing is studying with one of the best myelination techniques that's available. It's very hard in the infant brain to measure and segment the baby brain and measure these things, but we're working with a biophysicist from radiology with a new myelin detection technique. And with that myelin density measure, we can see along the arcuate, where you see it in red, the statistical evidence is very strong that there's a correlation between 14-month conversational turns and strength in the arcuate. And we're seeing the same thing with measures of neural density right in that region and 10-monther conversational turns. So early on, encouraging babies to do that back and forth, even if their vocalizations are primitive, is associated with these changes in the arcuate. Now, what direction is it going? Are the conversational turns changing the brain? Is the brain being changed by some other factor, and that's encouraging conversational turns? We don't know, but this is the earliest evidence that there's a link between the parent-infant conversational turn and the arcuate, which you saw in that earlier movie, is making the sensory motor connection. So these quite fancy measures, MRI measures, are being used in all of our studies now, and we're seeing correlations all over the place. This measure of myelin density and our measure of, it's a naughty technique, it's a very complex MRI structural measure, but it measures the density of neurons, and it's related to synaptic pruning, because as things get pruned, you get changes in neural density. So we're very excited about the neural density measures and what they could mean downstream. Okay, so I want to, before it's time to start wrapping up, talk to you about a number of interventions that I'm really excited about. When you look back on a long career of research, you learn a lot about what you think the the key principles are with regard to language learning, and language learning that you think these principles hold for both bilingual and monolingual babies. So about 5-6 years ago, we started developing a bilingual baby intervention, and it is now in software called Sparkling. And the idea is that we have a method and a curriculum, 32-week curriculum, that can be used in infant education centers for an hour a day to see if the method and the curriculum, which is very, very active, very, very social, very prone to back and forth conversational turns, even with the youngest babies, whether that works when applied. So in order to test it, we had to go to Madrid. It was a nice place to have to go to run an experiment. Madrid, Spain has all of its children 0 to 3 in infant education centers that are located in every neighborhood in the city, even in the poorest migrant worker neighborhoods to the wealthiest neighborhoods. These infant education centers are run by the government. The food is fantastic and it's free, and parents pay only what they can afford, and kids are in these education centers from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. So with the help of the Ministry of Education, we took undergraduates, University of Washington undergraduates, and you see one of them there wearing a Seahawks 12 t-shirt, and he's one of the coaches for the in the infant education centers. And the curriculum is a number of playful, it's both reading, it's conversational, it's game-like stuff that requires the infants and toddlers to interact and play. And for 1 hour a day, they get bathed in the English language. Their parents don't speak English, none of the teachers in the school speak English. The superintendent and the school directors don't speak English. This was really English from, for that 1 hour was the only time that these kids were exposed to English. So in the first experiment, we ran an 18-week intervention, and the data were really, really exciting, that with 18 weeks, 1 hour a day, again, randomized control. So we had kids coming from classrooms to this 1 hour English room, and then others staying in the classroom and getting just the Madrid standard bilingual education, which was 2 to 4 hours a week of book reading in English or songs in English or nursery rhymes in English, but nothing like what we were doing with Sparkling. And at the end of those 18 weeks, you can see in the middle panel, start of intervention, the CCT score, which is an automatic run on a tablet, word recognition in Spanish and English. The two groups, experimental control, were equal. At the end of 18 weeks, the monolingual kids who have been exposed to Spanish are much, much better. And they're brought up to the level that line indicates where monolingual English kids at 20 months are at. And so this is the average performance across the kids. And you can see the boost that you get from the exposure for 18 weeks. And on the right, you get vocalizations, which were quite phenomenal. What we really trained kids to do was to talk. They loved taking conversational turns, even in the youngest. So those age groups at the bottom, number 1 represents the 7 to 14 monthers, and you go up in age to those approaching 3 years at age group 4. And in all of them, you see this phenomenal increase in the English vocalizations. This is per child per hour. We had them talking like crazy. So these kids who were recorded every 2 weeks with Lena just became chatty. They just became chatty. As soon as the English, they walked into the English room with the English tutors, they would start chatting. And so again, we think this sensory motor stuff and this, when we look at pictures of the arcuate, you can kind of imagine that's what we're doing to the babies. So in the second, we went back there in 2017, and we published that in 2020. This time we went to 13 schools. We went to the poorest of poor neighborhoods in Madrid. We asked them to be in the schools in the poorest neighborhoods, the migrant worker neighborhoods where the parents were illiterate. And the ministry told us, you'll never get the kids to come to school, much less learn. And we said, we want to go there anyway. And the truth is the parents they are illiterate. They had to sign our forms, our human consent forms, after the director would speak to them in their native language. They would sign with an X. None of them in that particular area could read. So these kids had never been read to. So we were very interested in how they would respond. And our newest data show they respond phenomenally. In fact, their learning curves in the second round, we contrasted 18 weeks with 32 weeks. In the first 18 weeks in the poorest schools, their trajectory of learning is faster, higher. They learn faster than the kids who are wealthier, coming from wealthier neighborhoods. They level out in the second half of the school year, and the wealthier kids catch up. So they're indistinguishable at the end of 32 weeks. But that first 18 weeks where you seem to get this kind of avid learning from the kids whose experience, probably learning opportunities, have been much, much lower. So we were extremely gratified by these data, and really interested now to bring that software to the United States to use with dual language learners. So some of you may know that at the present time, the census says there's about 28% of children under the age of 8 who are learning a language other than English at home and then going into school in English-speaking schools. And they're having a lot of trouble doing well. And the projections for California are that 50% of kids under the age of 8 will be learning a primary language other than English. And so there is a need to encourage both the home language and the school language in young kids to get the benefits of bilingualism. Our newest software sparkling approach is to alternate between Spanish and English week to week, so that we encourage both languages to improve and hopefully improve executive functions of the kids. So we'll see about that. Now, finally, before I wrap it up here, there's our little bilingual graduates in Madrid. I want to say two things. First of all, we're now doing really fun experiments on face-to-face social interaction. We've got, in the first iteration of these studies, baby was in the traditional MEG and mom was wearing an ERP cap. In the ones that we're going to be running once we can get back to the lab, we've got baby in the traditional MEG and we've got mom in a brand new MEG that is a, quote, wearable MEG. We're beta testing a wearable MEG that is the sensors are lodged in a cap, and the cap is kind of tethered to the wall, but it's just a cap. So mom can move, and we don't have dueling hair dryers from Mars, but we've got one hair dryer from Mars, and mom is in this wearable MEG. So it's going to make looking at interbrain synchrony very much easier. And we're interested in how the brains of two people, particularly mothers and their infants or fathers and their infants, behave. Do they neurally synchronize? Meaning they show in, you'd expect this in particular frequencies like theta, that you would see firing at the same rate, potentially in the same areas at the same time when mom's attending. But when she turns away and ignores the baby, that connection should be broken and that interbrain synchrony should end. And the question is, how much does that interbrain synchrony measured early reflect what happens at home in social communication between parents and kids? And to what degree does that neural synchrony, social neural synchrony, predict language or predict other measures of social interaction and maybe attachment as children grow? So that work's underway, and I think it's going to be extremely fun using that new MEG. But the last phenomenon I wanted to tell you about was Christina Zhao's work, published in 2016. This was her dissertation. She came from the field of music and became a neuroscientist. She was a concert pianist, and that's her in the pink shirt on the left. And she used the language exposure technique, but exposed babies during that same window of time in 12 sessions in a social environment to the waltz, to a rhythmic pattern that is very, distinct. It's the triple meter of bump, 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 bump. And she played these kids during the 12 sessions, many, many different kinds of versions of the waltz. And the kids would tap out the rhythm of that beat. And the control group would have the same toys and the same social interaction, parents behind them, everything the same, except they didn't hear music. And then we tested them with MEG on their detection of rhythmic violations in both music and speech. And we're tracking language out to the age of 30 months. So here's what those sessions look like. Okay, so after the exposure babies and the control babies were done with their 12 sessions, they all came into the MEG facility and they listened to like a pure tone version of the waltz, but it would mistime one of the beats. So instead of bump, 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 it went bump, bump and delayed that third beat. And in speech, she used a Japanese contrast that is not phonemic in English, but relies on rhythmic change. And she noticed two very important things. One, that in auditory cortex, babies in the experimental group showed a heightened ability to anticipate that, that third note. And when it was delayed, they react strongly to the absence of that signal where the timing was expected and it didn't appear. They were better at pattern detection. And not only better at the pattern detection for music, but for this Japanese rhythmic contrast. So it generalizes to speech. Moreover, she showed an activity pattern in prefrontal cortex that was unique to the babies in the intervention group. So for those babies, as soon as the intervention babies, as soon as these patterns came on, babies were very active in prefrontal cortex and would again anticipate and show a reaction to those errors in rhythmic timing. And the kids in the control group did not do that. And so we began to think that what babies are doing is predicting the patterns. That pattern perception is sort of the game of early childhood, to understand in speech and in the visual world, in social interactions, and in many other activities. It's the patterns that count. And so we think what we've done, but we've only generalized it to speech. It would be interesting to generalize it far further to see to what degree have we made infants better pattern detectors by exposing them to a pattern as simple as the rhythm of a waltz. And so I think that set of experiments, Christina is following up with those, and I think they're going to be very, very interesting. So let's kind of sum up. Where are we with regard to the theory, native language neural commitment? We can see that experience produces learning, and the argument is that you're neurally committing circuitry in a way that's unique to the patterns that you're exposed to, whether that's one language or two. Native language perception is good, but non-native perception is a kind of metric of how much you're staying, how long do you stay in phase one? How long do you fail to separate what's in your environment and you should be attending to the more general pattern of the non-native speech that you're not being exposed to. And in a lot of our studies now, a good non-native perception is equated with slower language growth. And as I said, Christina's taken that out to age 6 now. Then secondly, social interaction is a really important driver of learning and vocalizations. And both, the learning and vocalizations tend to predict future learning. And I think that that's true because the reward system is linked to social interaction and to communication. It's so interesting to look at the field of autism, where language and social interaction are both delayed in children with autism, and to wonder about that link to the reward system, that faces and voices to children with autism are not very rewarding. That's what the evidence, Catherine Stavropoulos at UC Riverside has produced beautiful ERP data showing that children with autism do not show the reward response to a face, to a human face, but show it to other visual stimuli like arrows. And so it's not as though the reward system is not working, but it's working for a stimulus other than the social facial stimulus that typical kids are rewarded by. Inferior frontal areas are responsible for attention and motor planning are contributing strongly to learning. We can see in that brain, the MEG study published in 2014, I called it a kind of analysis by synthesis. The babies are using information from the motor planning areas, that set of computations are playing a role in this transition that occurs between 6 and 12 months. Exactly what it is, we don't know yet. We're projecting and speculating that it has to do with the use of nascent motor plans that kids have already formed by that time. I think what's new about the theory is that experience is feeding both sensory and motor neural circuitry, and that the sensory and motor systems have to be linked and communicating from the beginning. Exactly the mechanism, we don't know, but that they seem to be learning in tandem. And I'll show you, this is our native language neural commitment model. It's under revision. We want to build some of these. We had in there the perception production links and the importance of social factors. A lot of it was prefaced a long time ago, but I think we need a revision in terms of thinking that it's all sensory first and then sensory motor. This is more linked and earlier than before. And then finally, our work in language and speech is being really communicated quite widely, I think, throughout psychology, throughout neuroscience, in the world of education, and in the world of machine learning. Some of the work that we're doing relating learning to the social context and informal learning is contributing to foundations for a new science of learning. And so I think that all of us in this field should feel encouraged about the degree to which what we're doing is not isolated as much as it once was, and more of interest to the broad scientific community. So I've tried to mention collaborators and students and postdocs, but of course you inevitably forget. I have many, many wonderful students and collaborators and couldn't possibly do the work that I've done without them, and also without the funding, generous funding from the federal and philanthropic communities that have supported this work for a very long time. So with that, I'll close, and Matt, we are open for questions.